Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, your friendly guide to the English language. We talk about writing, history, rules, and other cool stuff. Today, I have a bunch of fun follow-ups from things that came up in recent episodes. Back in episode 1027, when I interviewed forensic linguist Natalie Schilling about how criminals' language can give them away, one of the answers was that criminals provide clues when they use regionalisms and don't realize they're doing it. These are words that are used only by people from certain locations, and she mentioned that she uses what linguists call the positive anymore, and for years didn't realize it wasn't widespread. And a few of you asked me for more information about the positive anymore, so here's a segment on that by Neil Whitman. In July 1994, The New Yorker published a short piece by Jack Winter called How I Met My Wife. The story is a barrage of sentences like this one. I was, after all, something to sneeze at, someone you could easily hold a candle to. Sentences like this one sound odd because the idioms in it are usually used in negative sentences. For example, that's nothing to sneeze at, or the movie is okay, but it can't hold a candle to the book. Because of this restriction, linguists call words and phrases like these negative polarity items. Actually, that name's not entirely accurate since negative polarity items also occur in questions, like, is that anything to sneeze at? Or in a few other constructions, such as few books can hold a candle to Pilkey's Captain Underpants series. Still, negative polarity items, or NPIs, is the name that's stuck. And not all NPIs are idioms. One of the most common NPIs in English is the word any. You can say, I didn't see any turtles, or do you have any gum? Or few people have any idea what goes on here. But sentences like, I saw any turtles, she has any gum, and lots of people have any idea what goes on here, they just don't make sense. However, there's one NPI in English that in some dialects has broken free of negations and questions. It's the word anymore. Just about every English speaker will accept anymore as a negative polarity item in sentences like, I don't love you anymore, or why don't we ever go out anymore? On the other hand, most English speakers stumble over sentences like these. Kids grow up fast anymore. It's always rainy anymore. Anymore, I do the cooking. If those sentences sound fine to you, then your variety of English grammar allows what linguists call positive anymore. If they don't sound fine, then feel free to mentally replace anymore with these days or nowadays. Although it's not a good idea to use the positive anymore in your formal writing, you should know that it's not a grammar mistake. It's a regionalism. The Oxford English Dictionary labels positive anymore as a feature of Irish English and has its earliest citation from 1898 in Northern Ireland. It also tags positive anymore as colloquial American English, and according to the Yale Grammatical Diversity Project's webpage on positive anymore is most common in the Midwest. There's also a small pocket of positive anymore speakers in Arizona. That's all. Or should I say there isn't any more. That segment was written by Neil Whitman, who has a PhD in linguistics and blogs at literalminded.wordpress.com. So for the purposes of forensic linguistics, you can imagine that maybe police have a ransom note or a threatening text message they know comes from somewhere in Arizona. If the writer, like Natalie, wasn't aware of using such telltale wording and used the positive anymore in the message, it could help the police narrow down the search to that small region where they know people use that particular language quirk. Next, in episode 1030 about archaic phrases, we mentioned the phrase wreak havoc, and people wanted to know about both the word havoc and about when you use wreaked versus wrought. So you can wreak devastation or revenge, but most often it seems people and storms are described as wreaking havoc. Well, what is this havoc? Originally, someone in the army would cry havoc, literally call out the word havoc, to give soldiers the order to start pillaging and just generally cause chaos. havoc. It appears, for example, in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. Caesar's spirit shall, with a monarch's voice, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. The origin of havoc isn't clear. No credible source seems certain of where it came from. But the word havoc might come from a Latin word that meant to have or possess, which kind of fits with the idea of soldiers running around grabbing things. And it eventually became a noun meaning destruction, confusion, disorder, and so on. Later, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, play havoc and make havoc became phrases, and even later the phrase work havoc appeared. Now, moving on to wreaked and wrought, in Old English, wreak meant to avenge, but much like the word havoc, it got tamer over time. It now means something more like to inflict or cause something, usually damage or destruction. So if you have wreaked havoc, you have inflicted all that destruction, confusion, and disorder. But wrought is actually an entirely separate word. It's an archaic past tense of the verb to work. And remember, work havoc was a phrase that people used alongside make havoc and play havoc. So you can see that if people were talking about working havoc, then they would also logically have said they wrought havoc, using the past tense form when they were talking about the past. In fact, Oxford Dictionaries says wrought havoc is an acceptable variant of wreaked havoc. And here's a little bit more about the words wreak and wrought. As for wrought, besides being an archaic past tense form of work in the sense of meaning to shape or forge, today it's also an adjective, and you'll hear it being used in phrases such as wrought iron, which is essentially iron worked into different shapes. Finally, a common mistake is to say that someone wreaked havoc instead of wreaked havoc. The words may sound a lot alike, but you don't wreak havoc. So remember, you can wreak havoc and work havoc, and if you did it in the past, you may have wreaked or wrought havoc, but just don't wreck it. Next, I got an interesting piece of feedback from a pilot in Seattle named Anya about the phrase we recently used, fly by the seat of your pants, and I thought you all might enjoy it. Anya wrote, "The phrase flying by the seat of one's pants has a specific technical meaning in aviation. While the general sense of proceeding by intuition is certainly accurate enough, there's actually an important tactile element to the term. When one initiates a turn in an airplane, it requires coordinated inputs from the ailerons, rolling, and the rudder, yawing or turning. How much rudder to add to a given turn is a difficult judgment and will vary based on the airplane, speed, and angle of bank. If you have too little rudder, you're described as slipping through the turn. Too much rudder, and you are skidding into the turn. These impart a lateral force onto the plane and its occupants. In a slipping turn, you feel like you're sliding to the outside of the plane. And in a skidding turn, you feel like you're falling into the turn. This is important for two reasons. Both of these uncoordinated turns are viscerally uncomfortable for passengers, but a skid can easily evolve into a spin, and then everyone is having a bad day. When you're learning to fly, it's important to learn to recognize when you're making an uncoordinated turn. There's an instrument on the panel for this purpose, aptly enough called the slip-skid indicator, or more formally, the turn and bank indicator. But when you are, say, maneuvering close to the ground, you need to keep your eyes outside of the plane, not on the instruments. So in flying by the seat of your pants, you learn to recognize the lateral forces from an uncoordinated turn at the point where your body interfaces with the aircraft, your rear end. You can quite literally feel your butt slide into or out of the turn on the seat. And this is what I thought was so cool about the phrase. It's rare that an idiom derives from such a discrete, tangible source. One small distinction I'd add, while in general use, the idiom often connotes someone who is acting without a plan or forethought, or even recklessly, in the aviation community, it's a phrase applied to a very capable pilot with excellent stick and rudder ability who's able to fly by the seat of their pants. That was fabulous, Anya. Thank you so much for sharing that bit of insider perspective and knowledge about flying. Finally, before we get to the Familect, I have a follow-up story from Dennis about being bilingual.
Hi, Grammar Girl. This isn't exactly a Familect story, but your discussion of learning languages reminds me of my sister's experience. She took French for 4 years in high school, and all her best friends were taking French, so they all spoke French to each other more often than English, partly to practice and partly so no one else would know what they were saying. And her boyfriend also took French, so when he graduated and joined the Coast Guard, they wrote letters to each other in French. And when she graduated and went to college, she took French her first semester, then decided to try German her second semester. Her German teacher said she spoke German with a French accent, not an English accent, which is her native language. By the way, my name is Dennis in San Francisco.
Thanks, Dennis. This reminded me so much of the Coffee Break Spanish podcast, which has been around as long as Grammar Girl and which I've always loved. But I'll never forget the first time I listened to it because Mark Pendleton, the host and also the founder of the whole Coffee Break Languages Network, Mark is Scottish. And it just kind of blew my mind at first trying to learn Spanish from someone with a Scottish accent. Like it was just not what I was expecting when I turned on that show. And finally today, I have a Familect story.
Hi, Grammar Girl. I have a funny story. My family and I usually go to Felipe's in Los Angeles before we go to Dodger games for lunch. And one time we went to Felipe's and decided to order a slice of pecan pie. And my husband and I have a tradition of sharing most of the things we order. And as I was finishing my sandwich, I turned to the friend on my right to have a chat with her, only to turn back around to my husband and our shared meal to realize that the pecan pie we had ordered to share was completely gone, and he instead had a sheepish look on his face. He just couldn't help himself. So to this day, our family calls pecan pieing somebody is when you take their share of something when it's meant to be split. Thought you'd enjoy it.
I did enjoy it. That feels like a widely applicable Familect. Thanks so much. If you want to share your Familect, a word or phrase your family uses based on some shared experience that nobody else would understand, you can do that in a voice chat on WhatsApp, or you can still call the voicemail line at 833-214-GIRL, and all of those are in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast listening app. I want to hear your stories. Grammar Girl is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Thanks to Davina Tomlin and Nat Hoops in marketing, Holly Hutchings in digital operations, Dan Feyerabend in audio, Morgan Christensen in advertising, and Brandon Getchus, director of podcasts, who recently started taking cooking classes. And I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl, and author of the tip-a-day book, The Grammar Daily, which, hint, hint, makes a great gift. That's all. Thanks for listening.